As the followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh descended on a ranch in Oregon to build a city called Rajneeshpuram, they ran into serious trouble with the law enforcement agencies, the immigration services, and eventually the FBI. If you have seen the Netflix documentary series Wild Wild Country, you probably know why modern city planning calls for the separation of church and state in its design, law, and public policy. However, it does discount the fact that most ancient, medieval, and pre-modern cities around the world were set up with strong religious cores, often with a church, mosque, or temple forming the city center, especially evident in a country like India. Over the years, though, religious and political movements, or political movements motivated by religion, have influenced not only the way Indian cities are planned, but also the way people live in a city. Having had intense conversations on these phenomena way too often, Karan and I decided to teach a winter school course called Reincarnating Cities at my alma mater, CEPT University, a couple of weeks ago. In the course, we took a deep dive into the changing architectural articulations of heritage, nationalism, and religiosity in the contemporary Indian urban space. From an ancient temple town such as Varanasi to riot-charged cities of Delhi and Ahmedabad, and the latest government experiment of creating a hyper-modern city in Amravati with linkages to traditional design principles of Vastu Shastra. We went all in. So let's get started. My name is Vaissnavi Shukl and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight unconventional design practices and research projects that reflect the emerging discourses within the design discipline and beyond. Architecture Off Center features conversations with some exceptionally creative individuals who have extrapolated the traditional fields of architecture, planning, landscape, and urban design.
To get us started, I'm going to ask you to tell me, how did you get into this religio-political thing? I know your thesis focused on conservation, but I'm trying to go back in time and figure out how we found this to be a mutual interest.
My thesis was about conservation, and I was doing critical conservation at the GSD. So that was the most sort of most direct academic manifestation of it. But so basically, why I'm interested in this is because I realize that it kind of combines many of my interests, which go beyond just architecture or whatever urban design that we've studied in school, which is very sort of technical, very formal, very vocational, practice-based. But I guess since I was a kid, I've been very interested in all kinds of things. I was very interested in mythology. I used to, as a kid growing up, like I used to sit with my grandparents and listen to stories about, how something happened and there were all these like mythical beings and all that stuff. So I grew to be very interested in theological or mythological ideas. And I was also very interested in history. I knew that maybe I didn't want to pursue history as, let's say, formal practice or get like advanced degrees in it. But I think I was very fascinated by, by trying to imagine how people lived at a particular point of time and how what they did or the decisions that those people took, long back, influenced the way that we live now. And this is something which is very kind of embedded into our psyche, especially growing up in India. You see traditions and you see like almost this ritualistic sense, this kind of lifestyle that we all grow up with. So I think there were a bunch of things that influenced it. And then obviously when I realized I wanted to do architecture, when I got into architecture school, this is what I was gravitating towards. Even in architecture school, like the case studies that I used to take up or the urban design projects that I wanted to, do during studio. And even then, finally, my dissertation and thesis were all about how cities and buildings themselves have evolved, and the way we think about them, the way people inhabit them, the way people conceptualize them, has a lot to do with these stories that I was told as a kid. All of these people from history.
So picking up from mythology, I also know you as somebody who has really strong political views, and and is also just like deeply intrigued by political movements and political ideologies. So we'll get to it, because I know you spoke about a part of it which deals with the history and mythology, but there's also a huge part of you which is so driven by politics. And well, let's get to it. So we finished teaching a class a couple of weeks ago, and I think we're going to teach it again because we enjoyed it so much. But we titled it Reincarnating Cities, Tracing Religio-Political Influences on Indian Architecture and Planning. And we both really racked our brains trying to come up with the right adjective to go with the word cities. I think some of the words that we were circling around was revitalizing, reimagining, reinvigorating. And I remember I was walking in Peabody Terrace talking to you, and we're like, oh my God, we have to call it something. And we're like, let's call it reincarnating. I want to dwell on this choice of word for a bit and know your thoughts on why this particular word isn't just a simplistic choice, but instead, as you went into the rabbit hole and discovered, has biblical origins.
Yeah, it's and in fact, I think we made a very interesting choice calling it reincarnating. I think there's something very intriguing about, the prospect of thinking of a city as something that grows and evolves and reincarnates. You're right that obviously the word itself has biblical origins because, well, literally it comes from the Latin word, which literally it just means to be made into flesh. But other than the biblical aspect of it, I think there's something very Indian about it, which is that there is this very Indian or Indic philosophical idea that which kind of defines, which has this almost foundational framework, which a lot of people have been trying to grasp through different ways. But architecturally speaking, the cities that we live in, they have origins in. You reach a point where you're trying to trace the origin of a city, let's say, right?
Yeah.
And some of the case studies that we did during our project during the course of the class were about these, and we went over which city can we talk about and how are these cities defined. And we realized that at one point you reach this sort of historical dead end, and then beyond that there's all this like mythology associated with it, especially when we were talking about a city like Varanasi, right? So when did it even begin? Who is to say? Now there are all these like creation myths that are associated with cities, the way creation myths are also associated with societies or other things. So there's a lot of stuff which is sort of all these layers that exist within the built fabric. Now it's very easy to kind of just see a city in its physical manifestation as it's in its physical form, but then are all these like subterranean layers that make a city what it is. It makes something habitable and something not. And people have very strong reactions to these things. And I think reincarnating for us kind of embodied all of those factors. The fact that something is born, then something, it leads a life, and then it dies, but it does not die forever. It doesn't vanish. It remains there, but its soul changes. And therefore, this philosophical idea, which really made us both inquisitive to learn more about as architects. So I think it was an interesting lens to view a much larger concept.
I think it's very interesting when you say when you trace the origins of a city back, you reach a dead end. And we split cities between us, right? So we're talking about 4 cities, and I was looking at Ahmedabad as one of the cities. And of course, the popular story is that Ahmedabad was set up by King Ahmad Shah, and that's why the name. But now again, within the political framework, there's a movement to advocate for a name change, which goes back to the version that was before Ahmedabad, which was Karnavati, which, the people who inhabited the place before that were living there. And you go back and you're almost in a Western sense looking at these people as natives, but it fizzles out and you never really know how a city was set up. Like, you don't know the origin story, but from the moment that history started recording it, you know who came and lived there and who left the city and then who came back in again. So even in that sense, while reincarnating, you look at the soul of it traveling and entering another body. In this sense, it's also like the body is the same, but the soul keeps changing. There's like a different essence to the place, and the city has its life with a different soul. And it's almost like sometimes, the soul doesn't even leave. Like it's there. There's remnants of a soul. And then another current comes in, another exogenous factor that comes in and changes the soul and modifies it. And then you have a whole new moment. So okay, let's go into like the depth of the class. So we were looking at 4 cities, right? We were looking at Varanasi, Delhi, Ahmedabad, and Amravati, kind of following a chronological timeline of their origins. Our argument, however, was that the evolution of cities is barely ever linear and gradual. It follows an almost cyclical pattern of development that is highly influenced by political and religious currents. And in the course of our research, we found things that we didn't know about our own cities, and that was quite a journey. But what was the most fascinating or bizarre incident that you thought influenced the planning of a city? I don't know if you want to talk about Banaras or if you want to talk about Delhi, but
I think there's so much to it, and what you just said is so right, because if you think about it, I mean, before I directly answer your question, I think your earlier point about the idea of calling it reincarnating cities. In retrospect, now when I think about it, as architects and urban planners, and as especially as people who are kind of who go through a formal education, we conceptualize cities as something very formal, something which is in opposition to, let's say, the urban is in conflict with the rural. Like, we consider these things as binaries. We say this is developed and this is not developed. We say this is a city is formal, a city is created, as opposed to something that is informal or something just kind of evolves organically. But from what we all understand and through our own lived experiences, we know that a city is a combination of many, many different things. And in that sense,
I'm going to interrupt you here and ask you to talk about the Corbusier quotes that you use for the class.
so, well, yeah, I mean, I think in our introduction lecture, we were talking about how Corbusier, as sort of this big fountainhead of modernism and this figurehead that most architects, at least of the previous generation in India, you have this bizarre reverence for, which frankly I don't fully understand. But I think it is obvious that Corbusier and all the great modernists of his age have had a lasting impact on the way we think of cities as something which is formal, as something which is created through particular shapes and forms, and it is the most correct way of doing something. And I think that is kind of how people like Corbusier define cities. And there are many different versions of this legacy. I mean, today we talk about master planning processes which define functions and allocate one particular system from a bird's eye point of view, and they use cartography and the mechanisms of bureaucracy
and the grid.
Exactly, and the grid. And we realize that once you zoom in, once you start seeing things from a human eye level, the way people use space is often very different from how it is conceptualized when you see it from a bird's eye point of view. And in India, most of the cities, quote unquote, that we live in, there is a very unclear definition of where rural begins and where it ends, or where what really urban is, or what is developed or what is not developed. Oftentimes you would see the idea of a maidan as something which is an open space, which might be formal from a bird's eye point of view, but has a variety of existences simultaneously. I mean, it could be a Durga Puja pandal for a fortnight, and then it would become something else entirely, a cricket ground by day. So there are all of these things at both the micro and the macro level. So I think we now, in retrospect, when I'm thinking about the idea of reincarnating cities, there's almost like this little mischief in the title, that we know that we're using a word which has been given to us.
Mischief, and maybe in the future misleading, but that's okay. I can live with that.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the whole point. I think we wanted to make it provocative, and we wanted to make it political, and we wanted to see how people themselves understand it, rather than impose our own in the class. To your question directly about the most interesting or the most bizarre thing that has influenced the city, it's so hard to say, because as we were reading about this, there's so many interesting facets and so many interesting historical milestones that we kind of came across. And then I think I personally was very startled by how one man, and invariably there is some man with a fragile ego in history, who took some kind of a decision, and then obviously this person died, right? But what he did just reverberated throughout history, and we still live with the effects of it. I mean, One interesting thing, for example, when I was doing just before the presentation on Delhi, and as we know that Delhi was built and rebuilt many, many, many times. They call it the seven cities of Delhi, but one can argue there are probably nine cities, if you count what happened even after, well, yeah, even after Lutyens. I mean, the 60s Delhi and Commonwealth Delhi. So one of the things, for instance, is I think one of the earliest cities of Delhi, there's a place called Tughlaqabad, which is in Delhi, and it's basically now it's almost this ruinous fort. There's very little habitation within it and around it, and it's very interesting to notice how this place got abandoned. There's so many other places which exist in Delhi, which are all these ancient cities, particularly Mehrauli, Siri, Jahanpana. All of these places are still inhabited. The people who live there, their demographics and all may have changed. But Tughlaqabad, for instance, is like a dead, deserted place. And what is weird is that in the early 14th century, I think somewhere around the 1320s or so, the ruler at the time, Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, he created this magnificent city because he wanted to, celebrate the triumph over the Mongols and all that stuff. But he, at the time, was sort of in this. Conflict is perhaps an overstatement, but he was in this sort of tussle politically with the most important Sufi saint of his day and age, who was Nizamuddin Aulia, who was in the other part of Delhi by the Yamuna. And then Nizamuddin, and there's this whole legend about, this apocryphal legend about, there was a curse and there was all this like other stuff. And this is, again, what we were discussing, the influence of mythology mixed with history, mixed with all of these things influencing the built architecture of a place. So apparently there was a curse, and that curse was never lifted. And then Ghiyasuddin perished in a battle, and then the city was just sort of left, even though most of it was complete. And then his descendants, I mean, including Muhammad bin Tughlaq, he decided to move his capital because he was aware of this curse. So he was kind of put off by it. So he went to the Deccan, and then he came back to Delhi. But then when he came back to Delhi, he didn't want to go back to Ghiyasuddin's city because he was still scared by the curse. So he created yet another city just because of this bizarre incident that happened in the 1320s. Till today, the place is this ruinous fort. And it's strange how all of these things happen. Obviously, this is a sort of a small story, but then there are obviously seminal political events that have been driven by communalism or political rhetoric that has influenced the city. I mean, when we were talking about, for instance, both Ahmedabad and Delhi, both of these cities have seen very violent communal clashes. And as a result of those events, there has been so much sorting on the ground in terms of how people have segregated themselves. Like a de facto segregation has taken place. And it's just so happened that, and obviously this influences people's access to resources, what kind of neighborhoods kids grow up in, what kind of schools they go to, what kind of roads they encounter, all of that stuff. So there's so many, I mean, Delhi, for instance, in 1984, there was the pogrom that happened. And then again, post 1992, there was so much sorting that happened and communalization and ghettoization of particularly Muslims over here. So there are all these events that keep happening, and they just change the fabric of a city. And it's very, it seems to me that all of these things are quite bizarre when you think about the fact that nobody in 1962, when the first master plan was being made, could have imagined that the city of Delhi would change this way in exactly 30 years. But it did happen in 1992. So people do make decisions. Sometimes they're top down, but sometimes they're also sorting on the ground. And the soul, as we said, keeps changing. But the body, keeps altering form simultaneously.
Well. Karan is on a roll and pulling out all the stops today. As we both take a breather, here's what the next episode has in store for you as we celebrate the International Women's Day with midwife and public health professional Christina Alonso. She is going to talk about designing for the female body, and I promise it's a conversation you don't want to miss.
So one of the things that happens when you're pregnant is that you're often told to get up on these gynecological tables that are very narrow. And as you become more pregnant, you become larger and larger. And these tables are like, oh my gosh, I'm going to fall off. How am I going to get on this. And so we were like, well, we don't actually need this table. So what we have is a single bed. So it's a lot closer to the floor. Women just have to, sit down on it. It's a lot more comfortable. And their children fit on the bed.
I'll meet you again right here 2 weeks from now. But first, let's reconnect with Karan.
While we see cities growing on their periphery kind of gradually, you don't see buildings come up in a day, but these events, which are often motivated by either religious or political ambitions, are pivotal in the way people end up living in certain parts of the. I mean, look at the case of Ahmedabad, right? There's been major riots in literally every decade since the 60s, 70s, since the Nav Nirman Andolan, where they overthrew the chief minister. And I mean, still there was a student movement, but in the 70s, 80s, of course, when we had the Godhra riots, it was completely different. But you see how these movements aggregate and marginalize a community, not only in terms of the way vote bank in a city is structured, but also in the way physically where people live. And these things are seldom part of a grid, which is such a Western concept when you're looking at planning a city and you invite a foreign firm like a renowned architect to come plan a new city like Amravati, for example, and the person kind of comes up with this grid. The grid does not talk about issues that are underlying a certain community or a certain region. I mean, the grid does not talk about informal settlements that, as we all know, become a huge part of the city. I mean, that's literally like the nerves and blood of the city, and that's what keeps the city going. But you barely ever see a master plan talking about having lung capacity to expand and contract and allow for all these other unplanned things to happen. I mean, somebody more radical might argue that they should never happen, and so you don't plan for them. But people lay claim to land and people set up. But it's tricky. It's tricky in the way that we look at these things. And I know both of us, we're partially also scared bringing up these topics in the class because you don't know where things are, how sensitive people can get to talking about religion or politics and look at it. But I mean, I think we tried our best in being objective. But another thing I think that came up in class, apart from the segregation and kind of religious marginalization in cities, is also the question of conservation and tourism. And that really fascinated me because we're seeing a movement not only in the country at a macro scale where cities are fighting to get the UNESCO World Heritage status, but also at a micro scale. I mean, we're talking as in Ahmedabad, we are all seeing a huge pushback against the demolition of the Lohikan dormitory. So there's something with conservation, and it's definitely come to the forefront now after the buildings have lived a certain life and need certain TLC, but also how conservation just becomes such an important part of tourism. I'm specifically thinking about Banaras, and you're talking about hotel salvation and how the Banaras master plan also in some sense does not allow for that organic feeling of the place to thrive as it would. But yet the master plan is trying to accommodate all the facilities and all the infrastructure that a modern day city would need to handle that kind of tourism. I don't know, it's tricky, but I thought your reading of Banaras was pretty stellar, especially in its relationship with tourism.
So many points to kind of take from what you just said. So I think conceptually, when we were also beginning the class and in our very first lecture, we talked about this idea that there is a linear formulation of history and of a city, and it kind of plays out in various capacities. The linear being that we go from one place to the other, and that we go from something to the promised land, and then there is the idea that you go from something that you're developing, and then eventually you reach like this developed status. There's always this linearity to our thought, and you realize that when you go back in time and you read about how this is almost like this colonial legacy of dealing with not just land and space, and of course as architects we're so obsessed with land and space, but with everything, even the way we are taught basic concepts. We are taught to think in terms of binaries. We ask what is good, what is bad. But then when you actually sit back and you think about all of this stuff, I think this is something that resonated with the both of us, which is that there is so much subjectivity in all of this stuff. And there is the question of agency, makes all of these things not a straight line, but almost like this circle, or I would say almost like a spiral, like an extended spiral, like a spring, where things go and they go through all of these ebbs and flows, and something happens that dramatically alters its course, but then the cycle keeps continuing. So, and the idea of subjectivity obviously is so obvious over here. I mean, we can go back philosophically and deal with this also from an academic viewpoint, where there is the Foucauldian idea of who is controlling the power and who has the knowledge to do that, who defines even what knowledge is. And you get into all of these epistemological questions and all that stuff. Now, that is at a very abstract level. But on the more direct level, which you bring up, which I found interesting in what you just said, the second point, which is that there is an architectural manifestation of this as well, right? The idea that, again, the conflict between linearity and the cycle, which is that if in a place like, let's say, Banaras or any other city, right, in India, there has been all of these cycles and ebbs and flows, and there is a cycle of birth and rebirth, then does conservation on a very fundamental philosophical level freeze time and space, right? Now, if you are saying that something is put into action, and again, you assume these processes to be technical and apolitical, which is a very modernist way of conceptualizing it. But again, there are human beings who are sitting at a table and making these decisions for you. Therefore, the idea of agency and accountability, right? But those people kind of just fade away into the background, and you just left with these bunch of laws and policies that are telling you to freeze space in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's interesting also that you bring up the idea of Louis Kahn and the dormitories. And there have been other movements also. I mean, in Delhi, the Raj Reval building, which was in Pragati Maidan, the Hall of Nations, was demolished. And again, there was the idea that, well, what do you do with all of these stunning examples of modernist architecture or Indian modernist architecture? But when people are saying that we must conserve these things, I am almost in two minds about it. At one level, as an architect, I understand their significance and I understand the beauty and I understand that these are all engineering marvels. But on the other hand, must we be freezing space just because they happen to be the works of some, a big modernist figurehead? The other point over here, which is interesting, is the idea of the literally the space-time crunch.
Yeah.
So earlier, when conservation really began, and then one can go back in history and go back to John Ruskin and William Morris and all the debates they had with Viollet Leduc and all that stuff. Now, again, there is this almost French Anglo legacy of conservation, because that's where all of this branch of intellectualism was growing. And then it was kind of just exported to the rest of the world. And the colonies, particularly India, became like a really great place to test out these theories
It's a
of
lab,
conservation.
right? It was a lab.
It's basically a laboratory, exactly, because in Europe, they couldn't find, or at least in England and France, they could not find those kind of places to test this out. But when they were doing archaeological excavations and epigraphical surveys in India, they realized that, oh, wow, I mean, history over here goes back 3,000 years, maybe 4,000, maybe 5. Who is to even say? So over here, it became interesting because the first wave of conservation, of quote unquote freezing space in a particular moment of time, was started off with something which was deemed to be ancient, right? And then slowly the second wave began to be dealing with things which were more medieval.
Mm-hmm.
And then within the medieval also, there was this whole argument, especially if you read what people like James Ferguson, Alexander Cunningham, who founded the ASI, weirdly enough, all of these people were writing about, they were saying that one kind of architecture is more important than the other.
Correct. It's basically privileging like one over the other, right? I mean, it's also important to kind of note that it's again a very Western colonial concept, in the sense that the Archaeological Survey of India was set up during the colonial period, right? So
yes, exactly. And by a person who had very little experience in South Asia, who came over here and then started doing all of these surveys and stuff like that. But at the same time, there was also a very white supremacist idea in his mind. All of these people considered, a very paternalistically, that we must teach people in the colony how to live because they are not, smart enough to figure out what to do with their own buildings, right? And that we must teach them something, and we must tell them what to do with the past, right? We must conceptualize the past for them. It's a very supremacist idea. And its architectural manifestation is the conservation movement that, in its third phase, started crunching the time even more.
Yeah.
So from ancient monuments, we went to medieval monument conservation, and then we started conserving, things which were, let's say, 40 years old or 50 years old.
Yeah.
And one strange thing that has now happened is that when you're talking about the dormitories of Khan, or when you're talking about Sector 1 Chandigarh by Corbusier, or for that matter, I mean, Raj Rival's Hall of Nations, these things, they happened very recently. These are all recent examples. And it's quite ironic at the same time that Corbusier, when he was writing, he was very critical of things that existed because he wanted to break away from the past, right? This obsession with modernity, the obsession of creating a brand new plan and a brand new kind of formalism. That in fact, he was the guy who wanted to, get rid of most of Paris, and he wanted to build a radiant city over there. And it's ironic that today we are preserving his buildings. And in that sense, there's almost like this identity crisis that I see personally, at the expense of being provocative. I think this is what really baffles me, because these things are so embedded and practiced through law. They're operationalized by bureaucratic agents who sit somewhere in Delhi and are defining policy, one size fits all kind of blanket policy for all of the nation. But I think that we as architects need to reconcile with the subjectivity of it and stop thinking in binaries. And now when you're talking about Amravati, there's almost this threat of, if the city does get built, that will they be conserving as they are building?
Yeah. Oh my God. I should link the Rem Koolhaas reading that we had given in class, because that's exactly what it's talking about, right? Just like, what exactly do you conserve, and how do cities grow if you're basically conserving everything?
Yeah, that's true. Exactly. And when you were talking about the UNESCO thing, at least, I mean, all over the world, I would say this is not just about India. And I don't want to come across as overtly critical of it, but I do understand the lure of it. I understand the idea of tourism. An anthropologist might disagree with me because they might think that, tourism is some kind of pandering to capital. But in a place like India, I see the merit of it as an industry. I understand why one needs to develop tourism also. And it's not, I'm saying all of this stuff against conservation, but at the same time, it's not that I would not want to conserve things. I love historical monuments just as much as any other person. But I just think that as architects, our responsibility, at least in practice, is to get into the idea of agency and try to look at context, try to understand how is one building situated within a habitat? How is it that people are conceptualizing the place around it? Is it causing more detriment than it is,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Amravati, and that's kind of like my little kind of obsession. So I'm going to say the word damned, but I don't know if I'll have to mark this episode as with an expletive. But anyways, that to me was, I mean, I kept on reading and I kept on finding stuff. I'd been following the project since a while, but thinking about that as literally something that we saw going from point A to point B to not existing at all. It's like I keep comparing it to that Netflix documentary series called the Fire Festival. I forgot the name, but it's about this music festival that was supposed to happen, but it never happened. But it created all the hype about it. Now, with Amravati, what was fascinating to see was multiple things, but one being just the obsession with Vastu, and how Vastu has become something that has shifted from personal faith to communal belief to now state-sponsored competitions to the extent that Foster and Partners were finally declared winners after de-declaring McCue and Associates. But their website, if you go to their website, it says the plan for Amravati, follows the traditional Vastu principles with the ministers' entrance from the east and this because it's auspicious. And I don't know if it has to do with creating a certain national identity. I mean, we can go all into central Vista, but even in case of Amravati, involving S.S. Rajamouli, who's the director of Bahubali, to be a part of the team or be a critique in terms of shortlisting designs because
So bizarre.
because the chief minister thought that the city of Mahishmati came closest to his vision for Amravati. Though Norman Foster's design does not look anything like it, but even the thought that political whims, for example, can shape entire cities, or if not cities, at least part of cities that kind of become the main identity. It was mind blowing. I mean, I went down the rabbit hole, of course, and then you see this mass housing MVRDV project in Pune, which also claims to follow rules of Vastu. And I'm not being, I mean, I'm not biased. To be honest, I've read Maya Matam, like in Sanskrit. I've read the Vastu treatise, and it talks nothing about mass housing projects or secretariats and parliaments. I mean, it started as a treatise that was literally looking at two building types. It was looking at the house and the temple. And then, post independence with liberalization, there was a sudden need to go back to what were the more Indian roots because we'd been colonized for a while. And so among the rise of yoga and Ayurveda and astrology, Vastu makes a comeback, and suddenly you start seeing the two building types, kind of the rules being extrapolated. And now you have Vastu for factories, and now you have Vastu for offices, and now you have literally Vastu for every building type, including office buildings like the secretariats and the ministries. I mean, well, okay, part of me also wants to argue that, well, but who said it has anything to do with religion? But even if you go back and look at the treatise, it was written in Sanskrit. And the time that it was written in Sanskrit, for a fact that it was only the Brahmins who could read and write in Sanskrit. So it was written for a certain section of the society, kind of making it more exclusive. Every single building process was closely related to different ceremonies that would worship certain gods or would make sacrifices to certain gods. So definitely, I would say it had religious origins, but how that body of knowledge has evolved over time and has now become a deciding factor in state-sponsored competitions. There was a Vastu consultant at the jury for Amravati, who opined on which design goes through, which doesn't go through. I mean, we don't look at architecture or cities from this perspective often, and that's what got me so excited. So while we were just chatting, we're like, damn, we wish we had this critical eye to really look at things in our surroundings, kind of peel back the layers and really think about all these events, all these phenomena, all these actors, all these networks of power that we would never assume exercise influence over the built environment, but they do. So there was kind of like a long blabber, but I said my piece.
No, but you're right. I think you're raising a couple of very important points. And now, obviously, we're not social scientists, but from what I understand is that what it's hinting at is firstly this large-scale branding exercise, almost, right? Now, and it is very reflective of the changes that we are seeing politically across national politics and all that. That there is this post-liberalization. You're absolutely right. After 1991, there was this strange kind of middle class aspiration almost, which was that not we aspire to be world class, like we want the glass and steel, that we want the cement and the Norman Fosters and the Marquis and the MVRDVs, but at the same time we also want it to be traditional in some sense. And traditional, I'm using very loosely as a word over here. The idea, at least to me now, while I don't know much about Vastu personally, I think it seems almost very surface level, very superficial, that somebody considers themselves to be like some kind of Vastu expert and they're defining what architecture should look like. It's almost a very superficial quality, and it kind of, what it does is it doesn't go into the real understanding of why these things were created to begin with in whatever ancient history, right? Like they were reflective of a particular time and place. They were reflective of a society that, for better or worse, existed at one point in the world, and whatever, in quote unquote Indian society. But perhaps they don't even match or the needs of what is there today. Now, a lot of people might consider this superstition. A lot of people might consider this communalization of space. But to me, it is a very superficial understanding of this, and almost like this identity crisis that, well, do we want to be doing all the things that we see in the West, but at the same time, we want to go back to some pre-colonial understanding of what space was, right? And we're caught in these two minds. And I think that, to me at least, and this is something that I was hinting at even in the master's thesis, that to me, this is the post-colonial, right? Like this is the break from the post-colonial, where we were defined by colonization and by the scars of it and the mental ravages that had happened. And now we are like, okay, enough is enough. Now 2 generations have passed, and we need to move beyond this. And I'm almost afraid that in our need to, in all our yearning, are we going to create some kind of superficial semblance of what was there in history, and also be stuck neither here nor there? It's very strange to me, and I think we're living in a very interesting time. And I think as architects, and we also need to understand that, well, the world is moving, and people's aspirations have changed.
I think it was very important to underline the phrase superficial understanding, because my beef, at least with Vastu, isn't its content, but its reading, because it does have some scientific understanding, right? It literally talks about the basics of design, which is you should look at ventilation, based on the location of the Indian subcontinent broadly on Earth. What are the good wind directions? How do you plan for arranging your building program with the movement of the sun, because certain functions require daylight, certain don't require daylight, just stuff like that. I mean, it does have a scientific side, but what it's come down to, and I mean, when you look at these mass housing projects that claim to be following Vastu, is you see that it's a very superficial reading of the whole text.
But this is also reflective of the larger societal change which is happening, like the idea of creating this political identity in the name of religion, to create a kind of majoritarianism that is in trying to be aggressive in its aspiration materially, is almost creating this exclusionary agenda at the same time,
because you can't do one without doing the other.
But that shouldn't be the case in anything. Like, why must we need to create another O capital in order to justify our own existence? I think the idea of superficial understanding of a space, what you just said, is exactly embodies this this kind of weird moment that we live in, right? Where we want to paint a kind of particular picture of the past, where everything, where there's almost this weird false sense of nostalgia. And it's so strange that anytime one is even talking about the past, we're talking about, figures that may or may not have existed. And sometimes, historical figures or whatever, like, we always tend to view these things nostalgically. I think conservation also, in some sense, is a form of nostalgia, or at least architectural nostalgia. And the idea of heritage itself keeps changing. The idea of heritage is so imbued in conservation, and it's strange that heritage itself, if you think about it, I mean, the fact that, of course, it's derived from the word for, it's associated with inheritance, something like that is passed on. It almost has this allusion to private property and tradition and, inheritance, and all that stuff. But who is to define this? Like, who is to say that this is worthy and this is not worthy? And now, while we want to mimic the past in some sense, superficially, we also want to go forward. And now we're just stuck in two minds. And what you're talking about with Amravati, and what you're talking about with, even the Central Vista and all of these things, what we've seen with what is happening with Varanasi also, it's again the same conflict. This is also, I guess, a part of the cycle of reincarnation.
It just goes back to our beginning, right? It's just that we're stuck in that
loop.
In also, but like a linear progression where we're either traditional or we're modern, and when we try to mix the two, it's not a gray space, but it's just literally like a weird mashup. But that brings me to our point. So we've taught the class. It's been a couple of weeks, and we've had some time to reflect on how we can take this forward. So what's next for you, and what's next for Reincarnating Cities?
What's next for me is $1 million question. I don't know, but of course, I think this is obviously something that we tried out as sort of an academic experiment. We both wanted to be associated with academia after having completed our masters. We both want to be at that intersection where we are practicing, learning new things, practically growing as designers or architects or whatever professions we're in, but at the same time being associated with theoretical frameworks that make us curious, that we gravitate towards intellectually. And I think Reincarnating Cities was sort of this little green shoot, which was like a result of it. So well, first of all, I really think that this is something waiting to be written. I think there's so much out there. I think there's so much that we can grapple with in terms of themes. And of course, seeing through the lens of architects, seeing through the lenses architects of, architecture and planning and all of these things that we studied as designers, there is a very interesting and almost a novel way of looking at things which are usually relegated to quote unquote the social sciences.
Yeah, absolutely.
That there's almost this kind of expunging of politics and religion that has happened, that had been happening for a very long time in academia and in practice. And now we're trying to say that, all of these things are absolutely cannot be divorced from each other. That the idea of religion and politics and society, that the idea of myths and heritage, the idea of nationalism is so suffused in everything that we see around ourselves in the spaces that we inhabit. And that is perhaps for me the biggest takeaway from this whole exercise that we did.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's important that we take this class forward. And also
if it all goes down the drain, if we write something and people absolutely just like throw it out the window, we're young and this is when we make mistakes. So, we always have that as a shield, just being young and being open to explore stuff. So Karan, thank you so much. This was fun. I hope we do like a version 2.0 once we're done teaching this again at some point. But thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. This was really good fun. And I can't wait for this whole series to go live. I'm really, really curious. And congratulations. You finally put it together. I'm so happy.
Special thanks to Kahan Shah for the background score. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Architecture Off Center on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes are released every 2 weeks. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Arc of Center. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. Thanks for listening.